Okay, the next section is the pharmaceutical industry. Question 12, which of the following best characterizes the process of getting a new drug developed by the FDA? The answer here is going to be C, phase 3, which is randomized controlled trials, clinical testing, is going to be the longest and the most expensive phase of testing. And that's the one where basically you've got to show that the drug is both effective and safe in sort of double blind controlled trials, where those taking the drug don't know if they're taking the drug or a placebo, and those that are actually conducting the study don't know which groups are the treatment and the control. So that's pretty long, expensive. You got to do a number of different trials, and that's far and away the most expensive one. 13. Which of the following is true about the drug testing process in the US? And the answer here is going to be D. Only about 30% of drugs approved by the FDA end up paying for themselves, which is really underscoring the high expense of drug testing and pharmaceutical research. Essentially, is that it's expensive just to come up with a compound that enters into clinical trials. And even if you make it all the way through clinical trials, which most don't, even if you don't make it all the way through, only about 30% of the ones that actually make it all the way through end up paying for themselves. So, we're talking about almost billions of dollars really to develop an effective drug. Number 14, patent protection can reduce innovation for all of the following reasons, except for the answer here is going to be C, consumers pay high prices for drugs protected by patents. That's certainly a cost of patent protection, but it's not a reason why innovation is going to go down. In fact, the high prices paid by consumers is the motivation for innovation that's actually happening. A and B are actually reasons why patent protection may reduce innovation. Basically, if you got a company that has a really long patent on a drug, then they have an incentive just to sort of sit on that drug rather than come up with improvements upon it or come up with new things. And certainly, if you have patent protection that's very strong, overly strong, this could deter subsequent innovation because a firm that wants to innovate on an existing drug or even use a similar, chemical compound to an existing drug may be deterred from doing so because they don't want to run into like a patent infringement lawsuit. Question 15. For which of the following reasons is patent protection more important in the pharmaceutical industry than in others? And the answer here is going to be all of the above. So first off, once you come up with a pharmaceutical, it's basically just a chemical compound that's pretty easy to copy. There's not really a high marginal cost of producing a drug. Most of the expense that goes into coming up with a new drug is just showing that it's both safe and effective. And once you've done that, anybody else can come in and copy it. And so, basically A, B, and C are all true here. Why, patent protection is more important in the pharmaceutical industry than, for example, in the commercial airline industry. I mean, if you're building a commercial jet, yeah, somebody else could have, a copy of your plans, but it's not like they could very easily ramp up production of those things. They need a lot of specialized labor, a lot of specialized capital to start producing these things. There's high marginal cost of production. And so, patent protection is certainly important in that industry, but not nearly so much as it would be in the pharmaceutical industry. Question 16, why is patent protection weaker in developing countries than in developed countries? And basically, the idea here is that if you're a developing country, your population generally has relatively low income. And so the social welfare loss from patent protection, which is basically that consumers are paying higher prices than they would be in a competitive market without patents, is going to matter more for these low income populations that, if there were to be patent protection, for a lot of those people in these developing countries, the drugs will simply be unaffordable. And so developing countries, when they're balancing the trade-off from patent protection, which is basically, do we want innovation or do we want to have affordable drugs for our consumers, they're putting more weight on affordability than they are on innovation, simply because that matters a lot more for a low-income population than it would be for a higher-income population. 17, which of the following is a barrier to price discrimination? So let's go through the wrong answers. Excuse me. A, pharmaceutical companies always make more money charging a single high price to consumers in every country. So that's not true. Pharmaceutical companies actually maximize their profit if they can maximize their profit in each individual market separately. And so they would rather maximize their profit by charging a higher price in the US, for example, than they would in Mexico, simply because the profit maximizing price in the US is different, higher, because of higher demand, higher income than it would be in Mexico. And if they had to charge the same price in the US and Mexico, then they would basically lose out on profit in the Mexican market. Now, of course, they might still do that because of the threat of sort of trade occurring between Mexico and the US. But if we assume these markets are completely separate, then the highest possible profit would be for that firm to engage in price discrimination and charge different prices in each market, the profit maximizing price in each market. And then C, laws in rich countries prohibit the reimportation of pharmaceuticals from poor countries. That's actually something that facilitates price discrimination. That allows price discrimination to occur, because if there was reimportation of pharmaceuticals from poor countries, then the pharmaceutical firms would not be willing to charge lower prices in poor countries for fear of those cheaper drugs in poor countries simply being reimported into the rich countries. So the only one of these is actually a barrier to price discrimination is if, for example, Congress sees that consumers in the U.S. are paying 5 times more for a drug than consumers in Mexico, then lawmakers in the U.S. may pressure these pharmaceutical companies to charge the same price to everybody. They may say that's unfair, and though the Congress people would probably like the pharmaceutical companies to charge a lower price in the U.S., they may simply respond to this by just charging the same high price everywhere. 18. Which of the following is true about pharmaceutical price controls? And basically the answer here is going to be D. The fact that there aren't price controls generally in the U.S. is what allows other countries to impose price controls of their own. Because if the U.S. had price controls, then what we would observe is that there'd be a lot less innovation by pharmaceutical companies because they wouldn't be able to make as much profit. And so the fact that pharmaceutical companies can still make their money back and earn a profit on the U.S. market means that as long as there's enough barriers to reimportation of drugs, that they're willing to sell these drugs for a lower price in other countries and still make a profit in the U.S. 19. Which of the following is an example of induced innovation? So induced innovation basically is when there's a change in the marketplace such that treating a new condition or a new population now becomes more profitable. And so the answer here would be B. Rising obesity rates in the U.S. or other countries too have shifted pharmaceutical research towards developing drugs that treat problems associated with obesity. So flashback 50 years or so, obesity wasn't nearly the problem as it is today, and you didn't have nearly as much research being done on things like diabetes, things like heart disease, things like weight loss. Now, because such a large fraction of the population is struggling with obesity, that there is a bigger market for this, and pharmaceutical research has shifted towards treating the problems associated with obesity. 20. What is true about the Orphan Drug Act in the United States? And so this is just sort of just remember what it is. Basically, the U.S. government offers a 50% tax reimbursement on clinical trial expenses for these orphan drugs. Really, the important thing to remember about the Orphan Drug Act is that, for an orphan drug, essentially there's not a lot of people that are suffering from the conditions that these drugs are meant to treat. And so with a lack of any kind of government intervention, there wouldn't be a lot of profit to do research on these drugs simply because the market's pretty small. But it still might make sense from a social welfare perspective to have research on those drugs. We don't know if these diseases, which right now don't affect a lot of people, they might affect a lot of people in the future. And we don't want to be sort of caught unawares in the future if this disease becomes much more prevalent and we have no research done on it whatsoever. Furthermore, oftentimes when you do research on sort of these orphan diseases, you might come up with a better treatment for something that's more widespread. And so an example of that is, one of the more promising sort of treatments for COVID-19 is the drug remdesivir, which was originally done as a treatment for Ebola. Now in the U.S., there's almost nobody that has Ebola. I think nobody actually has Ebola in the U.S. But if you remember a few years ago, there was, fears of an Ebola outbreak that was happening. There was a lot of money that was being sent towards government money that was being offered up for people to start doing research on Ebola. Remdesivir was one of those drugs that was found to be sort of promising to treat Ebola. And there's some similarities between COVID-19 and Ebola, not in terms of its symptoms, but sort of in terms of the genetics of the disease. And had we not done that initial research, we'd be much further behind on coming up with an effective treatment for COVID-19. So that's an example of, the positive spillover effects of doing research on these orphan diseases. 21. Which is the following is true about the thalidomide scandal in the 1960s? So the thalidomide scandal, essentially, thalidomide was being prescribed mostly in Europe to women that were pregnant to deal with their morning sickness. It was later found out that it led to a pretty high rate of birth defects, with children being born with malformed limbs. Uh, and so, and consequence of this scandal essentially was much more rigorous testing of drugs before they became approved by the FDA or whatever body in the country we're talking about. Um, Now, a side effect of the increased testing and the increased sort of scrutiny was that people became really worried about offering up drugs towards women that were pregnant or could be pregnant. And as a result, this is a legacy that we still see today, is that there's a huge gender bias in clinical trials, where there's a lot fewer women that are included in these clinical trials than men. And even when women are included, oftentimes they're not being included if they are, for example, on their period at the moment. And this is a problem because when women are taking these drugs, certainly we'd like to know how they affect them differently from men. And oftentimes women are going to be taking these drugs on their period, and we want to know how it's going to affect them then. And if we don't have that data in clinical trials, then this potentially could lead to more type 1 errors, where we're approving a drug that seems safe for men, but actually is dangerous to women, and even more type 2 errors, where we are rejecting a drug that maybe was harmful to men, but could have been safe and effective for women. And so certainly, more testing is a good thing, but we want to make sure that we're testing on a representative sample of the people that will actually be taking that drug. 22. How did the Kefauver-Harris Amendment of 1962 affect the pharmaceutical industry? And so this was the amendment that sort of grew out of the thalidomide scandal and introduced much more rigorous testing standards before approving a drug. And certainly when testing standards became more rigorous, the number of new drugs being developed fell significantly because, as we talked at the beginning of this section, pharmaceutical testing is very expensive. And one of the reasons why it's so expensive is because there's a lot of steps you got to go through before the FDA will approve a drug. Okay, which of the following is an example of type 1 error? And so type 1 error is when a drug is approved that should have been rejected. 24, which of the following is an example of type 2 error? That's just the opposite, and that's when a drug is rejected that should have been approved. And so, you do trials, and these trials are meant to show if drugs are effective and safe, and you have some sort of threshold that says there's enough effectiveness compared to, the potential side effects that we want to approve it. But the problem is that these tests aren't perfect, right? And you have samples, you try to get as representative of the population as you can, but there's always going to be some statistical error, right? And so if you do, one series of tests, you might show that a drug meets the approval standard or goes above it. If you did another sample, maybe that drug goes below the approval standard. You could do 1,000 tests and you have a distribution of results. Now, ideally, if those tests are really accurate and good, all the sort of distribution of the results that you found are all clustered around the true value. But if they're all over the place, then you might have a really wide distribution, and this is what leads to you to perhaps, getting a series of results that is far enough away from the true mean, the true value of, sort of the effectiveness and danger of that drug, that you may end up approving a drug you should have rejected, or you may end up rejecting a drug that you should have approved. Okay, 25. What's true about the trade-off between type 1 and type 2 errors? Essentially, this is that you can't have both, right? So if you want to increase the rigor of your testing standards, certainly you're going to approve fewer bad drugs, but that comes at the expense of rejecting more good drugs. And so if you're going to decrease type 1 error, you're going to increase type 2 error. If you are going to decrease type 2 error by relaxing standards, then of course you're going to increase type 1 error, because now with relaxed standards, you're going to approve more bad drugs. Okay, 26. Under which of the following scenarios would we not be concerned about the observed gender bias in clinical trial testing? The only one would be if men and women experience disease in the exact same way. Then it wouldn't matter if it's all men or all women in a clinical trial, because there's zero difference between the two genders. The reality of the situation is that certainly men and women are biologically different and are likely for certain diseases to have different responses. And so we want to make sure that we have representative testing populations or samples that are representative of the population that's going to be taking the drug. And if women are experiencing disease in a different way than men, then we want to make sure that we're observing how that disease is affecting women differently from men in testing, so that we're not making a type 1 error where we're approving a drug that's safe for men, dangerous for women, or we're not making a type 2 error where we're rejecting a drug that's dangerous for men but safe for women.